Hello, my name is Seán Ó Cuirreáin. I'm a former journalist, a former public servant. My talk is on the life and death of Patrick O'Donnell, murder mystery, courtroom drama and political intrigue. I'm delighted to have been invited by the RDS Library Speaker Series to take part in it and to talk to you on this particular subject. I suppose in one sense, if this were a game of charades, I'd be saying this is a book and a film, because the book that I've written on this subject, The Queen versus Patrick O'Donnell, has just been turned into a new film for TG Ceathair by the production company Rosk. It'll be screened early in 2022, and we'll have a chance to see a few short clips from that film in this talk today. I should say as well at the outset that this is a story with a twist in the tale, and I think it's probably well worth watching towards the end to see that particular twist. This is a story of two men: Patrick O'Donnell, born in 1838 in Donegal in the northwest of Ireland, and the Gaeltacht in Gweedore, and James Carey, born in Dublin in 1845. So there's about 7 years of difference between the two men. Now, they led very different, very separate lives, but they eventually did meet, with fatal consequences for both of them. I was thinking in terms of the poem written by Thomas Hardy many years later about the Titanic, the convergence of the twain, when he talks about that great line that says, "As the smart ship grew in stature, grace and hue, in shadowy, silent distance grew the iceberg too." That these two men would eventually meet, and for O'Donnell, Carey would be the iceberg and vice versa. So to understand the importance of Patrick O'Donnell, we need to first understand who Carey was and his significance. He was a bricklayer, a builder, a landlord, a religious man, a devout Catholic. He was, of course, a Fenian, and in the early 1880s, he was introduced into the Invincibles. The Invincibles are described as a murder gang, a murder club. Their objective was to effectively root out those who were upholding British rule in Ireland. So he came to prominence after the Phoenix Park murders. That happened in the 6th of May in 1882. And the target at that stage was to kill a guy called Thomas Burke. Burke was a very senior Irish politician. He was head of the public service, or the civil service, effectively. And they pounced on him outside the Viceregal Lodge, Áras an Uachtaráin today. And it was a very bloody, vicious, physical attack. Burke was a target, as I mentioned, but they also killed a second person as well. And the second person was Lord Cavendish. Lord Cavendish, on the left of your screen, had just arrived from Ireland to Ireland that very day, to be sworn in as the Chief Secretary for Ireland. He arrived with his new boss, who was the Earl Spencer, and they were taking over responsibility based in Viceregal Lodge, now Áras an Uachtaráin, as I say. And the objective was to kill Burke. But the Invincibles, when they attacked Burke, he was being accompanied by Cavendish, and they didn't know who Cavendish was. Photographs, by the way, didn't exist really much at that stage, or they weren't certainly published in the newspapers. They existed, but they were rare, and most people wouldn't have access to them. So they need people to be in the Phoenix Park to spot Thomas Burke and point him out. And as well as that, when they attacked him with long blades, surgical knives, effectively, and killed him viciously, Cavendish came to his help, or to aid him, and Cavendish was killed as well. This caused absolute horror and outrage throughout the establishment. It sent shivers of fear, because to have two such senior people, the permanent undersecretary, the most senior civil servant in Ireland, and as well as that, the new guy who had just arrived from London, both killed in the afternoon in broad daylight outside the residence of the Viceregal Lodge. It was sent shockwaves through the establishment. The Queen, Queen Victoria, of course, who was the monarch at that stage, she was scandalized by this. She couldn't believe that such a thing could happen. And as it happened, Lord Cavendish, Lord Frederick Cavendish, known as Freddie Cavendish, he was a very important person for more than one reason. He had spent a period of time working as a private secretary to Gladstone, the Prime Minister in the centre of the screen there. And because of that, he was well known in political circles. But as well as that, his wife was Lucy Littleton. And Lucy Littleton was a niece of the Prime Minister's wife. But as well as that, she worked as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. So Lucy Littleton had her foot both within the royalty and also in the political structures at the time. And that made her a very important person to them. And the death of her husband, savaged in Dublin by the Invincibles, made it an extraordinarily important crime. It might in some senses be compared to in our time, something like 9/11, it sent shockwaves through the establishment of the stage. The Queen, writing in her diary, said she could think of nothing else. She felt that no one was safe, and she informed all of her children about the savagery that had just happened, according to her. So the other person who was responsible, who was involved in it, was the Earl Spencer. He was outside, or he was at his residence in the Phoenix Park at the time when this happened, the Earl Spencer, and he too was shocked and horrified by all of it. Immediately, a massive manhunt started to try and find those people who were responsible. And the introduced new legislation immediately in Westminster called the Prevention of Crimes Ireland Act. It strengthened the law and made it easier to try to find solutions to this kind of crime. In some sense, as I mentioned 9/11 earlier on, it's kind of like the same response that happens when a state feels under threat. It strengthens its own legislation, and that certainly happened in this case. And the legislation they introduced allowed them, for example, to move cases from one part of the country to the other. But as well as that, it allowed the establishment of a system called a star chamber, where a judge and the police could work together to question people without recourse to a solicitor and on pain of being imprisoned if they refused to answer questions. So that was one of the new laws introduced to help them to find who was responsible for this particular crime. It was a huge international story all over the world. People talked about this deed of horror that had happened, and no one was sure initially who had done it, but quite soon afterwards, after the actual murders happened, there was a small card dropped into the offices of the newspapers in Dublin saying this deed was done by the Irish Invincibles. Very little was known about the Invincibles at that stage, but the man who was given responsibility to try to sort this out was Superintendent John Mallon, on the right of your screen there. He was a head of the detective branch of the police at the time, and his job was to try and find out who was responsible for these killings. He was a South Armagh man, a Catholic, but he was a man who knew his job as a police detective very well, and he used informants, he used trickery, he used pressure. He used the Star Chamber as well to try to gather information. And by eavesdropping to identify the killers, it took him a year, but he did get results. And eventually, arrests were made, and a large group of people believed to be responsible were brought to Kilmainham, to the jail there. And one of them was James Carey. James Carey, the main task, I suppose, in one sense, that Mallon had was to try to break James Carey, who was the leader of the Invincibles, and to try and turn him and to see if he could get him to give evidence against his colleagues. He used a lot of trickery to do it. One of the tricks he had was an interesting one. He had most of the prisoners in individual cells in Kilmainham, and at night time he had people bring in a desk, lights, and writing paper to the cell next door to where Carey was being held. Carey didn't know who was in the cell. He knew it was one of the Invincibles, but wasn't sure who it was. And then the Attorney General arrives in, and you hear muttering from the cell next door, but he has no idea. So he suspects that one of his colleagues is about to turn and give evidence against the rest of them, and he is petrified. Sometimes informers. Sometimes people become informers because of a reward. Sometimes they do it out of one principle, but James Carey did it to save his own neck. He was absolutely convinced by the trickery that was being used, some might say legitimately, by the police to try to break him, that he was afraid that he would be hanged. And the only way to avoid that was to actually turn and give evidence against his colleagues. He did that. He was brought into Green Street Courthouse in Dublin, and that shot shows a drawing of his first appearance in there, where everyone was shocked. He suspected that his friend Dan Curley, who was one of the Invincibles, was actually going to turn and give evidence. And when he came into court, he said he thought he was the guy in the cell next door that was about to break, and he said, "Dan, I was there ahead of you," And Dan Curley was looking at this in amazement, saying, to himself, he had never intended, and he gave a speech saying that he'd never intended at any stage to turn state's evidence or turn Crown evidence. So as a result of the evidence gained and the court cases, 5 people were hanged, 5 of the Invincibles were hanged, but 10 more spent years and years in jail. Then the authorities had a problem. What do you do with James Carey? Now, of course, they had no great graw for James Carey. He had killed 2 senior members of the establishment, so he had to be dealt with in some way. But they had to keep him. So they decided that the only thing that could be done would be to send him into what might be described now as a Victorian era witness protection program of some sort. It was to keep him safe, not, as I say, for any love of James Carey himself, but because the only way a state or system of government can get informers in the future is to protect the ones they've had in the past. Because if informers are killed routinely, then it's going to be much more difficult to break anyone to actually get them to turn evidence and essentially to have their colleagues hanged in this case and others imprisoned. So let me just park the story of James Carey there for a second and move on to the main topic of my talk, Patrick O'Donnell. Patrick O'Donnell was, as I said, born in the Donegal Gaeltacht, born in a place called Minachlady. He was a fluent Irish speaker, bhí sé líofa an Gaeilge agus a méarla, bhí an dá hanga rólas aige, ach ní bhíon chumas scríbnearta nó lihidish. He had no formal education, and consequently he was illiterate in both languages, Irish and English, which he spoke. The picture on the bottom left there is of the house where he was born. It's a modern picture of the house it's a little shed now at the moment where that's where he was born. And the picture on the right is of Patrick O'Donnell himself. We were very lucky to find this picture. It was actually taken in 1883. But back when, as a young man in the Donegal Gaeltacht in the pre-famine times, life was tough, very, very tough. Like the rest of rural Ireland, like the rest of Ireland, poverty was widespread, and there was little. His father had a small farm of land. There was the father and mother had 4 children. Patrick was the oldest, the eldest. There was one younger brother and 2 younger sisters. But the father decided that really and truly, this is now around the time of the famine. Right before the famine, in actual fact, that the best thing would be to do is to go to America. So he brought himself and his wife and Patrick and the brother to America. The 2 sisters stayed at home with relatives. And he intended making a livelihood in the States. As I said, times were very, very tough. But they didn't stay long in the States, 5 or 6 years, and they came back again because Patrick's father, Micheál O'Donnell, was afraid that the lack of morality in the States might influence the young children, so he decided to come home. He stayed home for quite a few years, and then as a young man, as he had himself, he decided to go back to the States. He went back in 1861 on his own hook, is how he described it. He went working in the mines, on the building railroads, steel. He was a man with, as I say, no formal education. So he was going to work as a laborer, hard, backbreaking work in and around Philadelphia for the most part, but other places as well, in Pennsylvania, in Delaware and Ohio, hard physical work. He eventually got employment as a puddler. The puddler was a guy who worked in the iron ore industry, and his job was to, when pig iron was being smelted to turn it into pliable iron that could be used, they needed someone to physically pour this molten iron, and it needed a skilled eye of a person. So he got that kind of a job, but it was a sort of a skilled laborer's job, backbreaking work in dangerous conditions where you were burning off various gases. And he spent many years doing that. While he was there, his family, his immediate family, his cousins were very, very deeply involved with the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania. The Molly Maguires were Irish Catholic terrorists, on one hand, if you wanted to believe that, or alternatively, they were brave defenders of the mine workers who were being exploited by the greedy mine owners. And it was a time of vicious attacks and killings. Many, many were killed, and at least 20 people were hanged, many of them from West Donegal. Now, there's no evidence that Patrick O'Donnell himself was involved with the Molly Maguires, but his family certainly was. And one of the first major vigilante attacks that happened there was in a place called Wiggins Patch, where on the 10th of December 1875, 2 of Patrick O'Donnell's cousins were viciously killed there. His cousin Charlie, his cousin Ellen, who was pregnant, and herself and her baby were killed, as was her husband was badly beaten up. Another brother absconded. He was a guy called James, also known as Freddie or Friday O'Donnell. So O'Donnell knew about the what was going on in these circles, but there was no evidence that he himself was in any way directly involved in it. So the family were aware of the Molly Maguires, directly involved. The cousins were directly involved, but Patrick O'Donnell himself, there's no evidence that he was involved, although he would have known about the existence of secret societies. He was over and back from the States quite a few times. He was granted US citizenship in Ohio in 1876, and that would become important later on in this story, that he actually was a fully fledged US citizen. As I say, he worked as a laborer, as a puddler in the iron industry. He also married a local woman from my own parish in Donegal, parish next door to Gweedore, Gortha, and he lived with her in Philadelphia, although he seemed to be absent from the home more often than anything else. They had no children, and he tended to stay for a while and then go off somewhere working and come back. But by 1883, May of 1883, Patrick O'Donnell had decided that America was played out, that there was no future. That was what he said himself, was played out. There was no future for him, and he decided he was heading off to South Africa, where he was going to make his fortune there in the diamond mines that were just starting there at that stage. Before he went, he came home to Ireland en route to South Africa. And one of the things he did, which I think is quite interesting, he went to a place called Doonwell in Donegal, Tumbra Doon, which is a holy well. And the reason he went there, and he spent nearly a week in the area around Kilmacrennan, visiting this holy well on a daily basis, is because he had an injured arm. His left arm was injured. There's various reports that he injured it as a young child. Others say that it happened while he was in the States. But he had a little device called the galvanic battery, which at the time was thought it gave a shock to the arm in the hope of kind of rekindling the nerves in it. And he had a galvanic battery, but he did also come and spend some time praying in Donegal, at Doonwell near Kilmacrennan, in the hope of getting a cure for his injured arm. Let me just go back there. He did eventually leave Donegal, headed via Derry to go to London, to go to Cape Town in South Africa, to start his new career in the mining industry out there. When he left London on the 3rd of July in 1883, he didn't go alone. He went on the ship called the Kinfon's Castle, and he was accompanied by a young woman, 18 years of age or so, on the right-hand side of the picture there on the top, from his own parish of Gweedore. Now, he met Susan in Derry while he was there. She was working as a maid, she was working in service, and she wasn't getting on with the lady for whom she was working. And Patrick O'Donnell invited her to come with him to South Africa, that they would marry en route and have a new life together there. There was quite a difference in age. He was 45, she was 18, but she decided to go with him. They tried to get married in London, but no priest would marry them there because they were unknown to them. The fact that Patrick had a wife already in Philadelphia doesn't seem to have entered into the equation, but he may have felt himself separated in some sense, even though the Catholic Church didn't recognize divorce of any kind. On board the ship, the Kilfon's Castle, they met Maggie and James Power, a couple from Dublin. They became very friendly people. It was a long journey from Cape Town from London south to Cape Town. It took but slightly more than 3 weeks, 7,200 nautical miles on a small ship. There was very few Irish people on board, and that's why Patrick O'Donnell and this young woman who was introduced as his wife, Susan O'Donnell, Patrick and Susan became very friendly with Maggie and James Power. And let's move on to a short clip as visaged from the video as to how, when the two of them met, what happened, when the two families met. James Power, my old flower.
Oh, Patrick O'Donnell. Yeah, devil, yeah. How are you, Susan?
Very good, and yourself?
Oh, I never bet that. Mate. Well, have you made up your mind?
About what?
Don't act thick with me, Patrick. Coming up to Natal. The four of us.
Well, I'd like to have a look around Cape Town first, you know, in the mines. I know a wee bit about that business. A bit more than your sheep farming up in Natal. I'll let you know tomorrow in Cape Town.
It's hard to get some out of a Donegal man's head when he's got it in there, huh? I'll get you a drink.
Patrick O'Donnell had intended working in mines in Cape Town, but his new friend on the ship, as they headed south, was trying to inveigle him to actually change his plans, go up the east coast of Africa, the Indian Ocean coast, to Durban, in Natal, where he was going to work, and that they'd come up and go as a group together. And when they arrived in Cape Town, Patrick O'Donnell found that it mightn't actually be quite as easy to make a fortune in the mines as he had originally thought. They just arrived there, and when they arrived the first night, the two O'Donnells and their new friends went into Cape Town and were looking to a pub and things like that. And the next day, before they were due to sail, and Patrick and Susan had agreed to make the journey up the coast to Durban with their new friends, the Powers. Mr. Power went to a pub again in Cape Town and got into a fight. And that fight was the unmasking of him, because in that fight at a pub, a barman recognized him. He said he knew he had a sketch from an old Irish newspaper, an Irish barman, and he went in and he found it. And he found the sketch on the right-hand side there. It was a supplement with the Freeman's Journal, and he recognized Mr. Power as actually being James Carey. So the friend that Patrick O'Donnell had made on the journey all the way down from London, thinking him to be James Power, was in actual fact the Invincible's informer, James Carey. The barman showed the picture to a young man from Norfolk in England on the left of the screen there, who happened to be in the pub at the time. This young man had travelled down, Robert Cubitt was his name, he had travelled down on the same ship with Patrick O'Donnell and with James Carey. And when the barman showed the picture to Cubitt, he agreed immediately that that definitely was James Carey. So Cubitt went immediately he knew that Patrick O'Donnell was about to go on the ship up to Durban with James Carey. So he ran down to the pier to show him the picture, and he brought the picture with him.
Mr. O'Donnell!
What's your hurry, Robert?
Look, this sketch was included in the Freeman's Journal. Just got it in a bar in town. That's him, isn't it, Mr. O'Donnell? Mr. Power. Mr. Power's James Carey.
Can't be.
It can't be, he said. He was absolutely scandalised that his new best friend was actually James Carey, the leader of the Invincibles and the informer of the Invincibles. However, reluctantly, he did continue on the S. Melrose, the ship that would bring him up to Durban, because everything was arranged. But he couldn't sleep on board the ship that night. Himself and Susan were there, and he was totally confused, he said later on, because he couldn't believe that this story was true. But on the next day, on the Sunday, 29th of July, he tried to avoid as much as he could meeting with James Carey, but they did actually eventually meet. And on board the Melrose, Patrick O'Donnell shot James Carey. He shot him in the throat. First bullet hit him in the throat, and two more in the back as he fell down. The fight happened instantly, and there's various versions as to why he shot him. It is clear that they had just decided to meet in the bar for a drink in the saloon on board the ship. And whatever caused the altercation, there was different versions of it, but it was a very short altercation. It was a small row, voices were raised, and all of a sudden, one man was shot, the other was on the floor, and two further bullets to his back. The news spread around the world immediately. The assassination of James Carey was huge news. It was actually celebrated in Ireland all over the place. Bonfires blazed to celebrate it. There was parades to cheering on O'Donnell for killing this man who was effectively, you might say, public enemy number one. Queen Victoria became aware of it, and she wrote in her diary, she said, "That shooting of Carey, though he richly deserved it, is not a good thing, as it shows the power of secret societies to be still very great." So immediately the narrative begins that O'Donnell shot him because he was the informer of the Invincibles, that he was the leader of the Invincibles. And that story, it certainly grew legs, as stories do. One of the problems with the media at the time was that it took 3 weeks for proper newspapers to come up from South Africa to London and on to other parts of the world. And consequently, an awful lot of fake news, as it might be described now, appeared about him. All kinds of weird and wonderful stories that he was sent to do it, that he did it, that he had tracked Carey, and all. The reality is quite clear, and it emerges in the court cases later on that he had absolutely no idea who this man was. He wouldn't have been friendly with him if he had known who he was. So the ship on which they were sailing, the Melrose, was brought into dock the nearest port in Port Elizabeth, and there was a post-mortem there of Carey's body, and he was buried behind the prison there, and effectively the prison graveyard there. And O'Donnell was brought to a magistrate's court where there was a committal hearing to check was there sufficient evidence to have him face a murder charge, and the decision was absolutely there was evidence there. He did kill Carey in front of witnesses in the bar on board the vessel. So the normal thing would be for the case to be heard in South Africa, but the British authorities decided that they didn't really trust the colony to have a fair trial, and that they thought he might get away with it in South Africa. So they decided to have him extradited back to Britain. His lawyer in Cape Town, or in South Africa, decided to go to the Supreme Court to try to stop that, but that didn't work. And as a result of that, Patrick O'Donnell was extradited back to England so as he would face charges in the courts there. The shots there of the celebrity status of Patrick O'Donnell in South Africa being brought to court, these are drawings from the old newspapers of the time, old illustrated newspapers like The Sketch, which shows him outside the prison, shows him in court there, shows him being brought in a pony and trap from the prison to the court. But effectively, it was decided that he would be brought back to face trial in Britain. Here's a short clip again that shows a conversation on board the ship with Maggie Carey.
They had only been drinking a minute. I had gone out to tend the baby. I heard a shot. I came back in and O'Donnell shot twice more. My husband shouted, "Maggie, I'm shot." Then that Donegal man came up to me and said, "Don't be hard on me, Maggie. I was sent out to do it."
Don't be hard on me, Maggie. It says, I was sent out to do it. Don't be hard on me, Maggie. Again, more of the narrative that he was sent out there to do it. I must say I admire the journalist, who was a guy from the New York Herald, who decided to join the ship that was bringing the various witnesses up from South Africa to give evidence at O'Donnell's trial. He joined the ship in Madeira on the way up, and then managed to corner Maggie Carey and talk to her and get information as to how she saw what happened on that particular fateful event. He was brought back to London. O'Donnell came back to London, brought back to London in handcuffs, a massive security operation, an extraordinary amount of security because it was believed that there might be some effort made to free him. And there was detectives all over the place, armed police on duty. And he was first of all brought to Bow Street Court, another case there in Bow Street Court where another magistrate decides, again, there's sufficient evidence. And in the end, he faces a judge and jury in the Old Bailey, Britain's most famous, most notorious court. The man to hear the case there was Mr. Justice Denman, and there's various images of Carey, there's various images there of O'Donnell in court itself in the Old Bailey, and the witnesses brought in to give evidence, various sketches. The newspapers at the time, the sketch newspapers at the time, were full of these pictures of O'Donnell because of the story was seen to be of huge importance. Mr. Justice Denman was assigned the case. The witnesses were brought up from South Africa, and O'Donnell had an extraordinary fund of money to help defend him in court. He was unaware of this, but because of the notoriety of Carey, American newspapers began a collection called the O'Donnell Defense Fund to gather money to provide him with the very best possible defense that he could have. Now, as it happened, as a man charged with murder, he was going to get free legal aid, or the equivalent of it anyway at that stage. But nevertheless, the fund had reached the sum total of $55,000, which would equate to about 1.5 million these days. So he had the best possible lawyers to defend him in court. And then the Crown on the other side had top lawyers as well. In fact, the case against O'Donnell was presented in court by the Attorney General himself. So it was a very, very serious court case. Court cases for murder in those days didn't last very long. In fact, the case against Patrick O'Donnell lasted only 2 days. And that would be the norm for murder cases in those days. The only defense witness that was introduced was a cab driver, that's a horse and cab driver, who had heard a conversation he had been talking to Carey's son while he was in South Africa. And Carey's son said the reason he didn't personally shoot Patrick O'Donnell was because his father had the gun. O'Donnell's defense was that he shot in self-defense, that he was afraid that Carey was going to kill him, and that consequently he drew his own gun and shot Carey. That was the main plank of the defense. Unfortunately, there was nobody else there to give any evidence to say that Carey had a gun, or that Carey drew a gun, or that Carey was going to kill him. But O'Donnell seemed to believe himself, be it right or wrong, that Carey was about to attack him, and that he acted sort of in advance of that he pulled his own gun and shot him 3 times. The fact that he shot him 3 times is also relevant, because you can imagine someone shooting in self-defense with 1 bullet, but using 2 more. But the argument O'Donnell's lawyers put up was that these actions were more or less simultaneous. And because of that, because it was simultaneous, it was everywhere one particular act. As I say, the case was heard before Mr. Justice Denman. Front page of the Illustrated London News, all of these pictures of all of the various witnesses in court. And after 2 days, a verdict is delivered. Here's how it was delivered.
Patrick O'Donnell, you have been found guilty of the willful murder of James Carey. The sentence for this crime is death. From here, you shall be taken into custody, and there you shall wait until a suitable date for your execution has been arranged. And on that day, you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy on your soul.
All of the pleadings made that it was self-defense fell on deaf ears. One of the main arguments was, well, why would he shoot Carey in front of witnesses? Why would he not wait until they were in Durban and he could shoot him in the wilderness? Why did he not throw him overboard on the journey during the nighttime when they'd be drinking in the bar together? Why did he not find a different way of doing it other than doing it in front of witnesses? One thing I should point out is that before the verdict was arrived, the jury went out, they spent a little while considering their verdict, and they came back with a question in writing to the judge. They wanted to distinguish between murder and manslaughter. The judge gave a version of that. He explained to them what constituted murder as distinct from manslaughter. But when the jury left again to keep considering their verdict, the defense team they objected. They said that the judge had gone overboard, that he made it nearly impossible for the jury to find that O'Donnell was not guilty or that it was manslaughter. But he dismissed that completely and said, no, there was no issue with his defense or his definition of murder and manslaughter. He also said, they came back a second time with another question. And the judge said that the jury had asked, in the second written question, he said, the jury wanted a definition of malice aforethought. O'Donnell had been charged with murder, willful murder with malice aforethought. And the judge said the jury had asked for a definition of malice aforethought, and the judge defined malice aforethought, and he said that there was no complaints from the defense team this time, although he did go very far to say that he narrowed it down in the O'Donnell case to say that you needed evidence that there was no malice involved. The US President, Chester A. Beatty, became involved in the story then because O'Donnell was a US citizen, and he pleaded that at least the hanging of O'Donnell be postponed temporarily to give a chance to see was there any way of appealing. Now, there was no proper appeal system in English law at that stage. Mostly it was appeals made based on sort of the royal prerogative or political decisions. But the person who made a case for O'Donnell was, strangely enough, well, probably not strangely enough, but Victor Hugo, the French writer. He was a person who had campaigned against capital punishment, and he personally telegraphed Queen Victoria saying to her that she would gain the support of very many people if she acted to have O'Donnell's hanging commuted, but there was no way that was going to happen, and O'Donnell was in fact hanged. He was in Newgate prison itself. He was hanged. There's the certificate of death and the certificate from the surgeon that shows that in very cold language that when he was examined, he was found to be dead, fairly obviously dead because he was actually hanged. But that was the records are there. They're perfectly kept records to show everything. And O'Donnell was buried in quicklime in the prison itself. That was the norm as well. That was the order of the judge as well, that he be buried within the confines of the prison. But years later, I think it was in 1902, the Newgate prison, which was attached to the Old Bailey court, that was actually knocked down and the Old Bailey rebuilt, and all of the bodies that were buried there were moved to a grave, to a massive grave or to a public grave in East London, and it's the City of London Cemetery, and there's a small marking on the right of the screen there where all of the bodies of the people who were buried in Newgate Prison were reburied in the City of London Cemetery, and there's a small marking where put up by the National Graves Association of Ireland to honour O'Donnell himself. O'Donnell certainly had hero status at this stage. There was on the left-hand side, that massive Celtic cross built in Glasnevin in his honour, built mostly with American money. There was memoriam cards made and sold throughout America, throughout the Irish community. And many years later, there was another massive cross erected in his honour in his native Gweithor in Donegal. That didn't happen until the 1950s, but the one in Glasnevin is there, and it was put up quite immediately after the case, after his hanging. O'Donnell was lauded as a hero for killing this guy who was public enemy number one. Even though he did himself say it was self-defense, and he made that case continuously, and even when he was being hanged, there was no chance of him changing his mind on that. I did promise you a twist in the tale, and let me introduce you that twist in the tale now. New evidence that I have found from a Home Office file. It's in the British National Archive in Kew in London. It was closed to public scrutiny for over 100 years. These events happened in 1883, and the cover of the file says closed until 1985. And in that file, you'll see this document, 61 pages, of Mr. Justice Denman's personal notes that he took, meticulous notes that he took during the trial. And also attached to those notes at the very back of the file by Mr. Denman himself, there's the second question that came from the jury. Now, I did mention a little earlier there that the judge told the court, told the defense, told the press, told everyone in court that the jury had sought a definition of malice aforethought. This question, the written question, the original question from the jury, suggests that that wasn't the question asked at all. It was actually a very, very different question. You can read it on the right-hand side there. It says, if we find prisoner guilty of murder without malice aforethought, can you take that verdict? In other words, let me repeat it, if we find prisoner guilty of murder without malice aforethought, can you take that verdict? What they're suggesting basically is that they really understood what malice aforethought meant, that they were heading towards a victory, or that they were heading towards a verdict of murder without malice aforethought, now which would actually be manslaughter effectively. But the judge didn't tell the court that. He didn't tell the defense team that. He didn't tell anyone that at all. He just said they've asked for a definition of malice aforethought. They clearly didn't ask for that. And really, that deflection of the jury's question and the supplanting of their question by a question posed only by the judge himself, it really was a matter of life and death for Patrick O'Donnell. Because Patrick O'Donnell, had he been found guilty of manslaughter, would got a few short years in jail at that stage. That was the common punishment in those days for manslaughter. But for a case of murder, it was to be hanged. But the question arises, why did Mr. Justice Denman disregard the jury's question? Why did he substitute an unasked question of his own? Had the court and the defense lawyers and the press been aware of this, surely that would have changed the whole dynamic of the trial. If the judge's behaviour had been known, it would have ensured some sort of appeal, surely, at a political level, to spare O'Donnell's life. Why was the Home Office archive file containing this information closed to public scrutiny for over 100 years? There are many other questions as well. Why did O'Donnell kill Carey? Did he believe his life was in jeopardy, having identified Carey as the infamous informer? Was there any element at all of nationalistic revenge for Carey's perceived treachery, giving evidence against his colleagues and having 5 of them hang simply to save his own life? Was the abhorrence of informers enough to drive O'Donnell to shoot Carey? Or was O'Donnell simply furious to have been misled and deceived by what he saw as his new best friend? There's another question that fascinates me. Is the loathing of informers and the hatred of them more pronounced in us Irish people than in other societies? Was O'Donnell's act of bravery, was it deserving of recognition as a national hero? Surely someone who acts to defend themselves in self-defense isn't seeking hero status. And there's no evidence that O'Donnell ever sought hero status, but he was proclaimed as a hero, and as the monuments to him, and even the annual event that commemorates him still to this day in Gweedore shows him as a national hero. Is it sufficient to kill an informer to be lauded as a hero? Was O'Donnell a victim of miscarriage of justice because Mr. Justice Denman handled this case in the way he did? These are some of the questions that I think arise in this particular case. Some of them you will find the answers to, I hope, in the book and in the TV documentary, which will be, as I say, screened in TG Cahir in 2022. I welcome queries on the subject matter, and I can be contacted through the publishers of the book, Four Courts Press, or through the TV production company, Rosk. Thank you for your interest in this talk, and my sincere thanks again to the RDS for the kind invitation to participate in this library speaker series. Go raibh míle maith agam, slán go fóill.